Yeah, I think maybe we can start. Thank you very much for coming today to hear our talk where we're going to present a little bit about our newcomer project that we were awarded through the cluster. And it is about how lions cooperate during collective action. Yeah, thank you for coming.
Can everybody online hear us? Is this microphone okay? Am I making you all deaf? No? Yes? Good. So we're just going to start with a brief overview about us and our background, outline of today's talk, and a primer on the study system for those of you who are not familiar with African lions. Okay, so we come from similar research interest backgrounds, but we come at our questions from different angles. We joined Meg Crowfoot's lab at MPI and University of Constance together on a collaborative research grant. My background, so I got my PhD from the University of Miami and was also co-advised by Craig Packer at the University of Minnesota Lion Center. I had two focuses in my PhD, and these focuses have carried on into my postdoc research. So the first one is just behavior ecology, lion biology, how do lions survive in their landscape? What does it mean for them to be social? And the second interest was how does sociality and cognition, how are they evolutionarily linked? So there are hypotheses that propose that something about being social places additional selective pressure on you to evolve added cognitive abilities, because you're not just dealing with your ecological environment, but you're also dealing with your social relationships. And so to investigate questions surrounding the link between sociality and cognition, I did a lot of research with captive facilities and gave lions a bunch of tests, and then gave these tests to other asocial species and compared them. And I found that lions outperform their asocial species on novel problems and cooperative problems, which is not surprising. From that work, I have now expanded to start to ask questions about how do lions in the wild make decisions? What does this mean for their cognition? Do they show cognitive complexity, specifically in cooperation? And we will get into that a bit more. That our talk will cover some of that, but that's just a bit of a background on me. After my PhD, I did a postdoc in South Africa, and then I spent a few years teaching in Egypt while also building up research in Botswana, which is where I met Jen.
I don't need that one. I had a bit of a wiggly route to my PhD. I was born and raised in the UK, which is actually quite boringly where I did all of my studying. So I did my undergraduate degree at Imperial, where I focused on biology with a kind of major in applied ecological sciences and global change. I then immediately ran away from academia as fast as I could and moved to Costa Rica for 2 years, where I managed managed research projects. So I coordinated 6 different projects on the Osa Peninsula. So we were doing surveys on leaf litter, which is actually weirdly a recurring theme for me. Primate studies, we were tagging turtles, we were also collecting a lot of otter scats, which was not my favorite thing I've ever done, but was better than lion scats, which I have also done. So I spent 2 years there, but I got a little bit jealous of all the researchers who actually got to do research rather than just reports and logistics and funding and MOUs, which it turns out that's what you do in research anyway. So I came back and I did my master's in ecology, evolution, and conservation at Imperial again, and this I focused on population models. I used integral projection models to look at horn size dynamics in antlers in Soay sheep and red deer. And then I left academia again, and then I became a high school teacher for a while, and then I managed wine stores in Cambridge for a year, which didn't make it onto there because I ran out of space. And then I got a job in the Czech Republic in the south, which is actually one of the best departments I've ever been in. Sorry. They were just incredibly welcoming. I don't know what it is about plant biologists. And there I was looking at functional diversity and the impact of different processes like the mean trait value on how invasive species impact leaf litter decomposition. And I very nearly did my PhD in that, but I happened to meet some lion biologists just before I accepted one in Singapore, who said they needed a database manager, which for some reason sounded appealing because I got to go out to Botswana. And this is where I met the NGO Leopard Ecology and Conservation, who are based in central Botswana in the central Kalahari region. I've been working with them since then. I started out just as a research assistant. I then did my PhD with them, and I'm now head of research, where together with the field coordinator, we manage a program on human-wildlife conflict, movement, long-term surveying, and a little bit about how to integrate traditional ecological knowledge and various other data streams. I'm not going to focus on that today, but if anyone does want to speak to me about that or has any interest in partnering with an NGO in Botswana, please do give me a shout. So during my PhD, I focused mostly on movement ecology of lions. I spent a lot of time in the field with these guys. These are my tracking team. Most of them were actually born inside the reserve, in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve, and they introduced me to the area and basically taught me everything I knew about lions, which was amazing, highly recommend. My actual research, though, focused on how do we validate different spatial models for conservation use. I started off looking at connectivity models, like different corridors, how do different models perform in different areas. Encouragingly, they all actually perform really well for lions, which is perhaps not surprising because Botswana is like a haven for wildlife. But it's also good to know the models are performing well. I then moved to do more home range stuff. How do we validate home ranges? And then I looked at how temperature restricts movement in lions. I did some other side projects along the way. I did some work with elephants and bomas, a little bit with mice wearing tracking backpacks, all pretty much how animals interact with their surroundings at some level. I've also more recently been delving into capitans with some other members of the department, with Meg. So that's my background, mostly a spatial ecologist, did a bit of population biology and community stuff, but this is pretty much my focus now, is how can we take models and use them for a conservation application. Do you want to start with your bit or my bit for this?
Either way, I'm easy.
So we were brought into the department, into Meg's department, on this collaborative research grant. And I think one of the major strengths we had as a team is that we've worked with 3 different long-term study sites. And these are from really different areas. So the Serengeti Lion Project has been running for a really long time, although it's not running now. But it did run for a really long time. And this is where we get most of our knowledge about lion biology from. But this is a super high productive system where you don't really see it. It's what we think of as typical lion behavior, but very few systems have this kind of level of resource. We also work with the Wangi Lion Project in Zimbabwe, and this is like a medium. The south part of the park is very, very arid, but the top part of the park has quite a lot of water. And then we also work in Kutsi Game Reserve in the semi-arid Kalahari region. And this is kind of at the lower end of density. And we kind of try and draw together data from all of these 3 study sites to answer questions about how lion societies operate based on the intraspecific variation that we see.
And so we met at Leopard Ecology and Conservation. I was busy. I'd finished up my cognitive research, and I was really interested in lion hunting behavior and when do they decide to work together, how do they work together, how do they come together. But it's really difficult to study lion hunting behavior. And so I think it was Craig that I think Jen told Craig that they have these amazing trackers in Botswana. As Jen said, they grew up in the reserve, their tracking skills are incredible, and they can actually recreate lion hunting behavior. So I originally came to Leopard Ecology and Conservation wanting to see if it would be possible to work with a team of trackers there to investigate lion cooperative hunting and just their hunting behavior, because what you can get is not only do you get the behavioral patterns of the lions, but you can recreate the past of the prey species. So I spent the first since 2016, I think we set off on this endeavor. We got some funding from National Geographic, piloted the study, saw that it was working, we're getting data in, and then came here, and this formed part of our collaborative research grant. And so we're just now getting all of this data back and digging into the analysis of that. But the one thing that this data does not have, so it can tell us spatially where all of the lions are going. So the trackers come out, you find a kill site, some of the lions are collared, so you pick up on a cluster of when they've sat somewhere. Typically, if they don't move for a while, that means they've killed something. So the trackers go out, investigate the site. If they find a carcass, they then backtrack and take handheld GPS units and record the path that the lions took and the path that the prey species took. The one thing this can't tell us is how they move together in time. So we get their spatial behavioral pattern, but we don't get how they're moving together in time. And we also don't get what's happened before this. How do they come together? how are they deciding to hunt, where are they moving on the landscape. And so that's a bit about what our newcomer grant is, that's a small part of what our newcomer grant is trying to get at, that we will talk to about today. Okay, so in today's talk, we're going to start with just a brief primer on the relevant bits of lion biology. Then we'll get into kind of the theoretical foundations of our major research questions surrounding how do lions come together, how do groups form, and what does this mean for collective action. We will then talk about our newcomer project. We just got back from the field, setting up the first pilot pride, so it's really exciting, and we have some very preliminary results. And then we'll just do a brief wrap-up. So moving on to the brief primer on lions. As you may have guessed, this is our study system. We work with African lions, mainly in southern Africa now, although I spent quite a bit of time delving into the Serengeti lions further up. So lions are social. They're the only social felid, but what do we mean when we say social? In this context, it's that they live in permanent and stable groups. Group membership is inherited, and it can be passed down through generations. So the groups can exist for several generations. When it comes to pride, so when you have a lion society, you have prides and coalitions. So the sexes are pretty split. Prides are groups of females. They're the territorial sex. They defend a territory. If you're born into a pride as a female, you maintain residence in that pride, and your offspring gain residence in that pride. Whereas if you're born into a pride as a male, you get kicked out or you leave around 3 to 4 years old. There are different mechanisms for dispersal that I won't get into here, but males leave their natal pride and set off to take over a pride of their own. So the male's resource that they defend is prides. Females defend a territory. Coalitions of males will temporarily associate with a pride. So if they successfully kick out the resident coalition, they will become that pride's resident coalition. They will sire offspring, and their goal is to maintain residence of that pride long enough for their offspring to survive and for their males to disperse. Lions are also fission-fusion. So although a pride can have several members of adult females ranging anywhere from 2 to 20, they're not necessarily all found together all at the same time. They'll form subgroups. So they'll fission off from the main group and then come back together. It's very rare that all members of a pride will be found together at the same time. So one of the questions that we're interested in is, how does that work? How do they come together? What do they do when they're apart? Finally, one of the really cool aspects of lions that has implications for our research questions is that, unlike the Lion King, they are not hierarchical. So they don't have a strict dominance hierarchy. And what that means is members of a pride have equal access to resources. So females don't have priority access to a carcass. In a coalition, males don't have priority access to mates. Everybody's pretty much equal. It's kind of a first come, first serve basis. And so that's a unique aspect of the study system that makes it really interesting to ask questions about cooperation and how they make decisions to act together, because they don't have to account for ranking, which raises, well, it relaxes some constraints.
I don't need that. So our kind of big overarching question is, what kind of factors drive lion group formation, their social structure, and also what factors are associated with certain collective actions and the level of collective actions that lions display in the wild. So we've kind of broken this down into two sections, one on some of the background and the interests we have in their social structure and the way they function and the way that groups come together, and another section on the actual collective action. And by that, for lions, we're pretty much mean group hunting and territory defense. And I think you kind of have to consider them hand in hand, because one lion might be doing both, might be doing neither, might be doing one. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that these kind of things are governed by multi-level selection. And so you can't really consider one without considering the other. So there's a lot of different reasons why lions might be in a group. And the first thing we kind of asked is, how do lions come together from being a solitary forager to a group living species? And the benefits are pretty clear. You see a lot of increased cub success when they crash together. You get access to mates, which you cannot do if you don't find another lion. You also can defend carcasses in areas with other large carnivores. And I think this is territory defense. I'm not sure we had a picture for that one. But in order to do this, you actually have to come together in the first place. And one of the mechanisms that's been proposed for this is the resource dispersion hypothesis, which at its core is saying, if you're a solo lion, you might have to visit one water hole a day. And if you go to that water hole, sometime it will have food, sometimes it won't have food. So if you want to have enough food to survive, you might actually need 3 water holes. But if you visit 3 water holes a day, on average, you probably have more food than you need. And so you can accommodate another lion at relatively little cost to yourself when the resources are rich enough and when they're dispersed enough. And this has various different predictions that could be tested empirically. And they've been tested in the very high density system of the Serengeti. But we've been quite interested in seeing if this still holds in these low density systems. And Kutsi, where I've been based for the last 5 years, is semi-arid. But Namibia, which is where we're going to be talking about later, this is the most arid that you find lions. This is the extreme of their range. They're moving, vast distances with home ranges that are in the thousands of kilometers. So we're trying to look at how much this might hold there. And there has been a little bit of work done on it previously. And some studies have found that lions do hold to it, and other studies have found they haven't, but there's been some kind of interaction between this fission fusion behavior and this group, what you would predict. So there's 2 major predictions. One is that as resource richness increases, you'll get larger group sizes. And the other is that as dispersion of resources increases, you get much larger ranges. They've actually found that the group size one has not held in lions, but what has held is that they fission more frequently. But their sample size was not actually large enough to test this beyond a very simple case study. So by pulling together the data from the Serengeti, from Wangi in Zimbabwe, from Botswana, and now from Namibia as well, we hope to be able to look at by what mechanism fission fusion actually allows them to exist in these very patchy resource landscapes. We're also kind of we're looking at 3 core areas of social organization and how these vary between different areas. So we look at home range overlap, we look at variation in pride size, and we look at variation in the rates of fission fusion. And what we're hoping to get at here is an empirical way to describe the level of territory exclusion. Because I think when they were described in the Serengeti, they talk about this a lot. It's the key driver of lion society. But actually, when you're in the Kalahari and you have 2,000 square kilometers to defend, we see very little evidence of territory defense. And it's very unclear to me whether that's that we just don't see it. So is it because we typically have just one member of the group collared and they're not patrolling, or they're only patrolling a small range? Or is it that the trade-off is no longer worth it? Once you've fed yourself, you cannot defend this. And this is something we're hoping to kind of get at with the newcomer by putting out kind of collars on all prides, as we'll talk about later. This is a really interesting question for us. We also want to look at how pride size is linked to these collective actions. So does pride size link to group size in territory defense if it happens, and in hunting if it happens? And we want to look at how fission fusion provides a mechanism for the right lions to be in the right place to do these activities. And all of that will kind of be overlaid on this gradient we have of richness and dispersion in these different landscapes. If you're really good at measuring landscapes, you could email us. Give you some help with this. But yeah, this is some of the stuff that we're interested to do kind of very, very broadly in both our collaborative research grant and where the newcomer came out of.
So building on that, this has implications for lions' ability to cooperate and act collectively. Where you are in the landscape, who you're with, how you get together, what landscape are you dealing with, what prey is available, can all have an impact on how and when they cooperate. And so another big aspect of our interest is, when do we expect groups to move beyond hunting collectively to hunting collaboratively to role specialization? So what is meant by this? Lions show several different types of hunting and different levels of complexity in their group behavior when they do hunt. From a single lion, in Kutsi we have single females taking down an adult giraffe, which is an insane feat for a single lion. You also have group hunting that is just cooperation. So you could think of hunting collectively as just a lot of lions together going at the same problem, but not accounting for their partner. So you're allowing individuals in your group to participate with you in this action to take down this resource, say a buffalo that is really big, really risky, hard to take down by yourself. With a group of you, it's easier to just pile on and pull it down, but it doesn't necessarily require any sort of complex strategy. You can all just run at it and jump on it. Then you move on to hunting collaboratively, which occurs if you're, say, taking into account your partner's behavior. So if your partner is crouched in the bush, you're aware that the partner is crouched in the bush, so you run at the prey. From that, you can end up with what is called role specialization. So that's going to be when each individual has a role and they occupy that role repeatedly. So you are an ambush lion, you are a stalking lion. So say you have a pair hunting, one is usually the stalker, one is usually the ambusher. We want to know, when do we expect these levels of complex cooperation to occur? What factors determine whether it's possible, and how do lions decide which type of hunting they're going to employ? There is not a lot of information on this, surprisingly. The most in-depth studies were done in the 90s. Another aspect of lion hunting is what drives hunting behavior. In some systems, like in the Serengeti, they found that groups of lions don't actually get more meat, so taking down a buffalo doesn't actually give you any sort of food benefit. You're not going to eat more versus a single one taking down a warthog. And that's something we want to explore more, because when it was done in the 90s, they used measures like belly size. So we'll get into how we hope to improve on that and really ask, is that the case across all of these systems? The study that was done that looked at role specialization was done by Stander in Namibia. It's the only evidence of role specialization in lions. Researching lion hunts, as I said, is really difficult. It was particularly difficult probably in the 90s. He had to follow the lions for days on end and record their behavior on a handheld, what I can't imagine is high quality video camera. But he did find evidence of role specialization. We have not seen that evidence elsewhere, but also haven't been able to look for it very thoroughly. What Stander found is that lions would occupy roles. So let me see if I can explain this. So these are the different roles that they could occupy. You have wings, which are on the outside, and you have centers on the middle. What Stander found is individual lions would regularly either be a right wing, a left wing, or a center. So a center and a right wing will hunt together, a center and a left wing will hunt together. And if an individual ends up not in its preferred role, the hunt is not as successful. And so this is a really complex level of hunting, and it has only been shown in Namibia so far. When we set off in Botswana to originally look at this and ask these types of questions using the sand trackers and the maps, we found that those lions actually are hunting by themselves a whole lot, which raises other interesting questions, but does not really allow you to get at this question of when do lions role specialize. So in Namibia, in standard studies, the population there, 70% of the hunts are group hunts. They're cooperating, they're role specializing, versus in our Botswana field site, it's less than 15% of the hunts we're finding are pairs, not even large groups. So we are also hoping that this will be a really nice comparative system we will be in Namibia, which we'll talk about later, but we are going to be getting data from Namibia lions and investigating these questions, and hopefully that will also be a nice comparison to the Botswana system as to why are we seeing different things. Historically, role specialization was thought to be quite ubiquitous. Lions were just assumed to cooperate when they hunted and to employ some level of cooperative complexity. The same was thought of for wild dogs, but recently a study using high-resolution GPS collars found that wild dogs, in fact, do not always employ role specialization. In areas that aren't flat open plains, they tend to just have a more simplistic type of cooperation, which raises the same question of when do you see role specialization, when do you not, when is it beneficial, and what is driving these behaviors. So, as I mentioned, a lot of this work was done in the 90s, the work on chimpanzees, a lot of these kinds of studies trying to get at what drives cooperation, evolutionary game theory models, role specialization were done when the technology was pretty limited. So Stander just had radio collars, no GPS collars, and had to follow the lions for days on end using a handheld video camera. Now we suddenly have all of this technology that can allow us to really get into these behaviors and get fine-scale data on hunting behavior, on lions' movements, on what they're doing across these landscapes, and start to finally get at these questions in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I think it's worth stressing that he took over 1,000 hours of observation over 5 years, and he got, I think, just up to 100 hunts on one single pride. And a similar study done in the Serengeti that was over 3 years, they actually only captured 5 hunts in the entire 3 years, successful hunts. And they concluded there was no cooperation, but their study was essentially unsuccessful hunts. So was it just that they didn't see the successful hunts where they might have cooperated? And yeah, 15% is very different to 70%, but we're capturing now, because we're using telemetry to inform at least where to look for the hunts, we're capturing a much higher rate of the hunting than they were before. And these observational studies are fantastic. They're the foundation of our knowledge, but it becomes logistically really intractable to say anything about hunting success with those kind of like returns on your effort, unless you have endless money, an endless team, and lions that are very tolerant, and maybe they like to hunt in the open and not at nighttime. So this is really a big opportunity, I think, for us to not only answer like how often they're hunting, even these basic questions.
So our main questions around when and why cooperate is, what group hunting strategies are these lions using? What are they actually doing? How do social and ecological variations shape the emergence of cooperation versus when do you get collaboration versus when do you see role specialization? And then finally, what's the role of long-distance communication in fission-fusion dynamics and the availability of hunting partners? If you are a role-specialized individual and lions are fission-fusion and they have subgroups, you're scattered across the landscape, how do you recruit your partner that is the best partner to be hunting with? How does a right wing end up recruiting the center that they need to take something down? Okay, now on to the Newcomer Project.
Yeah, so we're actually going to be talking about just a small aspect. So some of the Newcomer Project is based on simulation, some of it is based on kind of theoretical models. We're going to be talking here about one segment of it, which is some data we are collecting on group hunts on a very specific pride of lions in Namibia, hopefully more to come soon. Namibia is really interesting because, as I said, it's at the very, very arid range. So in that top corner there, you can see, this is just the world clim precipitation, but you can see the range there that you get in sub-Saharan Africa. The gray is the Lions Range, and we're right there. Actually, it claims not to be in the Lions Range, but it is, we've seen them. And we're right there at the very, very arid end of it. But what's interesting about that is as you go across the country of Namibia, I mean, none of it's productive, but you have the full gradient of different savannas and habitats within this arid setting. So this is where we're focusing, and to be able to work here, we're partnering with an organization called the Lion Rangers, and these are a combination of non-governmental organization, the Ministry of Environment, other interested parties who are coming together to protect both wildlife and people in the landscape. And the core component of this is actually the Lion Rangers, who are all farmers who grew up in this region, and they're now taking their time to patrol and collect ecological and behavioral data on the lions. And we're hoping to be able to use a little bit of the knowledge for our kind of fundamental ecological research and behavioral and all these other things, but also to help protect the livestock in the area. So anyone who's interested about what they're doing there, please do go give them a read. They're doing some really cool stuff with early warning systems and with other different, they have towers set up to set off alarms. So that's really cool. We're really excited to be partnering with them. And I think if it works, just to show you the landscape we're in, this is actually where we went over just a few months ago. We drove over here. I was not quite aware of what it would be like to drive into this area because we actually drove over those mountains in our little field car that is not made for that. But this is where we were out putting on collars on a pilot pride. And this is going to be the first of we're aiming to have prides across the whole gradient, but this mountain range, this is our central pride. So over near Etosha, you have a much more productive system. This is your typical savanna. Then in the middle, you have a whole line of Namibia that is just mountain ranges. And they thought lions actually went locally extinct in this area, and then they recolonized from Etosha, I think, all outwards towards a small pocket in the Skeleton Desert. And this is where this pride has come from. And then ultimately we will be aiming to get into the desert proper too as time goes by. But we went over there. We spent hours and hours and hours sitting by this zebra carcass waiting for them to come. But we managed to capture a group of 6 lions, which actually have split off from another pride, I think about 3 years ago when this litter was born. So this is a mum and her 5 sub-adults. They've got 1 sub-adult male and the rest are females. They're all what we call independent sub-adults. They could survive alone, but they're still with the group, and they're still, in fact, with not their natal pride, but with their mother. And what we've done is we put collars on all of these, and the base collar is a Vectronics Vertex Plus, which will provide 15-minute GPS data for the entirety of the deployment, which is going to be 2 years over 6-month chunks. This also has accelerometry at 32 Hertz and triaxial. We also attached an audio logger that's going to provide continuous narration of their activities for 6 weeks for each deployment. We have a high-res GPS device that should also give us just over a month. And we have some more accelerometry and magnetometry just in case some of the other ones fail. We are relatively lucky that lions are big, so you can put a lot of battery on that. Saying that, these are some of the smallest lions, so we actually did have to do some piloting and scale back initially to make sure that we are meeting the ethical. We actually aim, I don't know about other species, but we aim for less than 2% of a body weight, because also as they're moving, that increases. And these lions have quite long extended periods where food might be quite scarce, so we do definitely err on the side of caution. It's also why we like to bait when we collar them so that they get an extra meal.
And why they look at here, they just had some lovely zebra. Yeah, so we put these out, and this is our pilot Pride, and we'll be collecting them again in September. So a lot of this is store on board, unfortunately, so the audio and all the really high resolution stuff, we won't get that back until later this year, which we're very excited about. But what we are getting back is just GPS fixes at a much lower resolution of hourly and 2 hourly at the moment. So we've had a brief look at these, and here we go, I think, if this works. So this is the map of Namibia, and you can see we're in the Kunene region, which is in the northwest of Namibia. It is really big. That is like the size of a small country, which is probably why you get so many habitats. But if we zoom in here, you can see this is the group of 6 moving. And this was really interesting for me because the groups that I've seen and the groups I'm used to, they're completely flat. We have a lookout point in Botswana, and it's 10 meters higher than the rest of the landscape. And these guys are moving through these mountain passes. So that was one thing that I was not really prepared for, even though they told me. The second thing is just the way that these guys are using the paths. So a lot of these are old riverbeds that cut through the mountains. My data from Botswana over the last 20 years, it does not look like this. It's much more diffuse. These guys use repeatedly. I will caveat this is only 2 months of data, which for a lion is not a lot. It takes them a long time to cover their home range, but we are still seeing this repeated use of these different ones. And what else is very, very unusual for me is the extent of cohesion in this group. And we're not sure yet whether this is a factor of the group being still quite young, so they stick together because it's a life history thing, or it's because their movement is very restricted between these peaks and this landscape. Or it could be another reason, they're just a very cohesive group. This is also the peak dry season. So this is when a lot of people would predict that lions would actually split up and not be together because resources are a lot more scarce. But it's also what Stander noticed in Namibia was that actually they came together because you really needed to maximize any chance for hunting that you could when resources were so scarce. And I think it's quite interesting to me because in Botswana, they're on average, when I think about territory defense, when I think about fish and fusion, I think about the animals being 20 kilometers apart at minimum, sometimes up to 100 kilometers apart. So you absolutely cannot call back your partner. And maybe this is why we're not seeing a lot of cooperative hunting in Botswana, because you simply cannot call someone back in time, or you simply can't call them to do any other kind of action together. Whereas these guys, they're actually really very close together. As I said, this is just the same clip, but here, instead of having a color per individual, I've colored this by elevation. So you can see they really are, it's not like they're just sticking to the lowlands. This, as it goes more pink, this is actually quite high elevation. So they're using this full range, which has some interesting questions that we hadn't really thought about how we model a home range in 3D, which we're hoping that some people in this cluster will have had some experience with animals that more typically move across different ranges. And also to think about the energetics of having to climb up these slopes, because that's very different to moving long distances on a wide open savanna. So we've just very, very briefly taken a look at some movement parameters. Anyone who has used the continuous time movement model will be familiar with these. But for those of you who aren't, this top one in the corner, this is just the home range area. The confidence intervals here are very wide because we have very limited data. But you can see that this mean, the population mean, is about 1,000 to 2,000 square kilometers. This is very similar to what we see in Botswana, is pretty much the maximum that you ever really get for a lion home range. If you add together so lions shift their home range over time, so you can get much larger values if you sum up
all the different non-stationary ranges over time. But this is kind of the largest value we ever see in a single time. We also looked at the speed, the average distance that they're moving per day. And what's really interesting to me is that all of them have a very similar home range size, but OPL 29, which is the mother, she actually moves much more each day. Because the difference of, say, 13 to 14 kilometers a day and 16 to 17, this is the difference that we see between productive and less productive habitats. And I think she's the yellow one in the movements, and you see that she separates off. So she moves within the same range, but moves further within this day to day. And then the other two things, these are just things, technical things for us that we're learning, which is that we were expecting, so you can think of the tau position as kind of the average time it takes for an animal to cross its range several times or to reach independence in location. And you want a really decent number of these for a home range estimate. And this is about 12, so we're thinking to get N of 20, that's about 6 months, which happens to be the length of our deployments. So that was good to verify. And we also looked at the velocity timescale because we're very interested in path recreation to see where the animals were between sampling points. And you generally want to make sure that your sampling interval is significantly below this, which you can think of as persistence in motion. It's also inversely related to tortuosity. And our collars under the hood are recording every 15 minutes, and then also with the high resolution. So this was just encouraging to us that we are at least going to have some of the data that we need to answer some of the questions we're interested in. And then we just did a very quick look at how far away all the lions are from each other, and also expressed in two different ways. This is the average distance in kilometers, and you can see that all of the subadults, so that's 21 to 28, these guys are within a kilometer of each other at all times. This is unusually cohesive for a lion group compared to what we've seen in other regions. The mother is a little bit further away on average. She's sometimes up to a kilometer away, which is actually more typical for lions, but also could be an indication that she might leave the group, which sometimes happens. She could then return to the natal group once they're sufficiently independent. But the proximity ratio is just a measure of mean squared difference compared to what you'd expect by chance. And if this is significantly under 1, this shows that it's a closer association. Like it's based on autocorrelation of the differences between their location vectors. It's just an indication that they're definitely moving together, which I think you can see from the animation. But yeah, ultimately we will have much more sophisticated ways to look at how cohesive this group are, but with the data we have now and the limited things, this is just a sneak peek into what's coming in. Some of the stuff we're really excited about is the high resolution stuff, which is new for us. We've had a lot of experience working with low resolution, 15 minutes, an hourly, kind of over long periods of time. So while we're waiting for it to come in from the field, we did go pilot some of our devices in a semi-captive situation. So you don't actually get full-on hunts very often, but they are moving around a lot more than the average zoo animal. And we could record them when they're being fed and when they're doing various different behaviors. And this is something we're currently working through at the moment. And we're partnering with Dr. Simon Chamil-Jean, who's created our audio loggers, and Matthew Weirs, who is from Wild Crew in Oxford, and I did my PhD with him. And he's done some really cool work on classifying behaviors using not just accelerometry, magnetometry, and IMU data, but also integrating the audio into this. We have a few more data streams than we have, and a lot more data, just because of the way the batteries have improved. So we're hoping that we can, he worked with 5 different behavioral classes, and we're hoping to expand this. But I think there's many, many different ways that people can use and approach this data. So we're in the process of labeling all of this right now. If anyone can think of a use or would like to be involved, you know, we're here. And then one of the other data streams we've got coming in, which you may or may not hear, I don't know whether this will work. This is actually not a lion roaring, I'm sorry, I just don't have a picture of it, it's yawning. But we're really interested in picking up where they're vocalizing. And the most typical vocalization for a lion, I don't know how to turn it up. There's a very, very quiet roar. But this is what it looks like if you visualize it. And the thing that's quite interesting about, I mean, one thing that's very convenient is they're very easy to pick up in the audio. And Matt's actually found that preliminarily, going through our data, that we should be able to pick these up even just from the acceleration alone, which would make this data set extend far beyond the life of the 6 weeks of audio, which is good because it takes them longer than 6 weeks to cover their range. And we're quite interested in looking at where within their range they vocalize, who do they vocalize to, and does this kind of act as a precursor towards coming back together when they're split up. And one thing that is quite cool is we think that we should be able to identify individuals from this chuffing at the end. So most people think of the big part of the roar as the important part, but the areas that they found the most variation is this end bit. And this means we'll be able to pick up not just the lions that we know that we're recording, but also if a foreign lion comes in, which will allow us to validate, were they alone, did any other lions come close? The other thing that's easiest to pick up is eating and drinking. I think, we're aware that one pride in and of itself is a fairly small pilot, but there's a lot we still don't know about how often they do hunt, who gets to eat when they hunt, and how often they get to eat, whether they were present or not. And so we're going to use this pilot pride as at least a way to look at that and start getting some baseline values on this. What else are we doing? Is that?
So to wrap up, our big question is kind of cooperative hunting raises fundamental questions about the ways in which animals can come together, perceive and communicate information, the extent to which they actively coordinate with each other to achieve joint aims, and the emergence of role specialization in animal collectives. On top of these questions, we are also interested in grouping and how that varies. So what is the variation among these? So within a pride, we want to delve into really how do they come together, how do they communicate, how do they recruit partners, how are they successful in their landscape. But we also want to look at this across a range of ecological contexts. So the mountain pride versus a pride in the desert proper versus the pride that is in a little bit more productive habitat. And prides also can be heterogeneous groups. So we want to address all of these questions on several levels and in a comparative context. So our plan is we're getting the collars off from this first pilot pride in the fall, and then the plan is to continue putting collars out on other prides, recollar the mountain pride, and just build up this data set and be able to answer these questions in lots of different contexts. As we've mentioned multiple times, this is starting off, so if anybody is interested in collaborating or has any way that they can think of using this data that we haven't thought of, because it's going to be a pretty rich data set, please get in touch with us. We are here, we are open to collaborate, and I think we left enough time for questions or discussion, but thank you all for bearing with us.
Thank you.
This is an amazing system, wonderful. I'm so excited to see what you get when this first deployment comes back. So when we look at group hunting, we also face a challenge. I think you probably face exactly the same challenge. And I think you highlighted it really nicely. I had a quick look at the one paper from Namibia. The data almost looks too good to be true. Yeah. So anyway, it would be wonderful to see what you get out of that. But one question I have is, how do you differentiate between coordinated hunting and cooperative hunting? Because I think Alan Wilson's work that you highlighted as well with the wild dogs shows they're clearly coordinating it. But there's a big difference between determining coordination versus establishing cooperation. And so I wondered what your thoughts are, because we tend to be very cautious and not claim cooperation, because that really relates to fitness consequences and at least proxies of intake, whereas there's often much clearer evidence that it's coordination, but the two are not equivalent necessarily.
No, so that's actually partly why we're trying to understand actually how much they eat and how often they eat, because it is been very unclear whether there is any punishment. Mm-hmm. So this is actually, it's kind of too much to fit into a talk, but one of the reasons that I was really excited to collaborate with Natalia is because she's done a lot of cognitive experiments in captive settings, and that's something we've definitely discussed for this, to look at what would be the mechanisms to pick up if you really are working. Like, can they even detect if someone is cheating per se or not participating? And are there actually any follow-up punishments? Like, you don't participate, do you get to eat? How much do you get to eat? And okay, we won't be able to grab the meat and weigh it, but we can hear how long they eat for and when they actually get to have that. So I think that audio should be a route to be able to answer a little bit of that, because it's certainly something that's really, really difficult to pick apart. And even with Alan Wilson's group, actually, they were not seeing consistent patterns in even the syncing of the time that they ran for things. And again, because of battery constraints, they have a huge sample size, but the vast majority of that is just one per group. And they also had to make the assumption that every time they accelerated, that was a hunt. So everyone's facing these same challenges, and I think you're just building small pieces of the picture as to what you can add to it. I think there would definitely be value in looking at it across. Like, maybe in your system it's easier for you to get at one piece of the pie, and maybe in our system it's easier to get at that, because it's...
I think your system's
yeah.
easier. You asking the right questions, you have a wonderful system for doing so. But I think what I'm kind of, and I think you might be highlighting this yourself, is that in the past people saw coordination and assumed it was cooperation.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily the case. I mean, in the wild dogs, anyone, I walk my dog in this forest all the time, they chase things, right?
Yep.
And so if you're moving together in a group and you chase things, that could look like some degree of coordination, but it may not actually be cooperation. So I think the null hypothesis actually is something people don't often evaluate. And I think you're absolutely right with the communication channels you have access to. And I was even wondering, once they eat, then this, is there a change in the motion characteristics on the accelerometry that give you an indication of a big meal versus a medium versus a small or something like that? But I think, you're definitely addressing it in exactly the right way. But it's amazing that we don't know.
I know.
Lions really are hunting.
But it's crazy. It's crazy what we don't know, because we were talking to people about how far because with all the vocalization stuff, we're thinking, okay, well, we know how far our audio logger can pick it up, but how far away can a lion hear it? We don't know.
And there's not even a vocal repertoire for lions yet. So it's not like a library of their vocalization. So there's just so much that we don't know that is really surprising when you start to dig into these types of questions. You think, well, somebody must have looked at this.
Very exciting.
Thank you. Anyone else?
No.
Maybe for the same cooperation of collaborative hunting, are you thinking of using drones? Because that might give you more information, at least how the prey is moving.
Yeah.
And
So
maybe you can do something how they are coordinating or not coordinating.
Yeah.
We've talked about using drones. Go for it.
So permissions. I think we need to have a better, more established relationship in Namibia before we start chucking drones out everywhere. On a very practical level. It's just another set of hoops to jump through. I think the other challenge that we kind of touched on earlier is that lions hunt at nighttime, so you're looking at a thermal drone there, and then you're looking at how predictable is it that they hunt at nighttime. So how predictable is it that you're going to have the drone there on the right night at the right time to follow them and not disturb the hunt? So yes, ideally we would love to.
And there's logistics. So we are really remote. I mean, I don't know how to describe how remote we are. There's no signal. There's not electricity. You have to charge things off your car battery. So having a drone, you'd have to have 1 million batteries. But then how do you have those in the car and your equipment? So it's practical things and also logistical things. But we would really like to figure out how to do it. So if anybody is interested.
Yeah, and we think maybe once we have more of an idea of how frequently they are hunting to know if it was worth it, then that would be an avenue to go down. And also then you just have a little bit more data and a little bit more, we're hoping that at some point the technology where it can follow the VHF on the collar, that'll be sufficient that would make it a bit easier even to start with. Because the distances are huge, right?
It's very
they move very far in a night.
We are setting up to do backtracking, like similar to what we've done in Botswana with the trackers, to recreate a subset of the kill site. So at least we would have a subset where we knew what the prey was doing. We wouldn't know it temporally because we wouldn't have had a GPS collar on it, but we would have the data on the lions and then the path that the prey took at least, and so we could plot those together to get an idea. I can hear you. We can repeat the question for the Zoom if you want.
Yeah, so I'm actually studying about individual triangular learning system, which is called reinforcement learning, which is very simple, but it's very known that it's really challenging to learn through failure, and especially it would be really challenging to learn how to coordinate through the repeated failure experiments, because the reinforcement learning agents doesn't learn. They're able to learn which parameter they need to change to, because in coordination system, of course, it's not only you, but also others' behavior would be like important. So I was wondering how they can actually learn down to coordinate.
Sure.
And do they use some kind of communication to establish this, or how is it possible?
So the question was, how do they actually learn to coordinate? That's a great question. So in the cognitive research that I have done on them, I'm not sure if I don't know what the communication is. I'd imagine they're somehow communicating with each other. But lions are really good at picking up what needs to be done. So for example, with the puzzle box, it took them a while. They use a lot of trial and error learning, but once they figure it out, they figure it out. So one mechanism could be that when they're this young age, they spend a lot of time failing at hunts, but once they're successful, that kind of sticks in there, and so then they repeat that behavior. I'm not sure if that would work in your system, but I think it's a lot of trial, and the cognitive experiments I did, I saw a lot of trial and error learning, but the first time they figured it out, they never forgot it. Even I went back a year later, and they still remembered exactly what they did.
I think we're going to start small in some ways as well, where like maybe we can't immediately get at cooperation, coordination, these things, but what we can get at is role specialization, not just in hunting, but in other activities. Mm-hmm. And if we think about this quite broadly, so I think it was like actually Damien Frieden had a paper in 20-something, some 20s, that looked at different axes of how animals can work together when they're hunting. And I think we're going to take a similar approach in some ways, where we're going to start off by saying, okay, but can we tell if they repeatedly go first? Can we tell if there's repeated lateralization? Can we tell if there's other axes of how they can behave in this that they at least do in a repeatable way, and that they're more successful when they do it? And if we can at least start there, then we can start to build up, start to say, well, this happens a lot. How could they be communicating when they're doing this? How could they decide whether they're taking the right or the left? And maybe we don't get there fully, but hopefully we get
on our way to there.
I think there's another question in there.
When you said that the lions will learn really fast with stuff like puzzle boxes, have you looked at whether they'll copy another lion?
Okay, so the question is about whether lions with puzzle boxes, so social learning, do lions exhibit social learning? I started experiments with that. COVID hit. And I didn't get to finish them. So I have N of one lion in one trial, where I put the puzzle box out with a lion that knew how to do it, and then a lion that had never seen it before watched the lion do it. The lion that hadn't seen it before managed to do it, but it's impossible to know if that was social learning. I saw some evidence of social learning when they were very unsuccessful on a different task. If you put them in with a successful one, a subset of them then solved it, but it wasn't a high enough sample size to actually say whether or not it was significant. I would be surprised if there isn't some kind of social learning.
Do you think that role specialization would always entail higher cognitive feats, or do you think it can just be based on, for example, the largest lion just assumes the center position, and the other one is just the one right? Can they just be because the size?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just the sorts. Right.
They can do. I mean, they would need some mechanism by which they still made that decision, but I don't think it necessarily needs to be a function of. I think you could imagine coordination on a level of complexity, specialization on a range, and there might be some kind of interaction between them, where some forms do require it and some forms don't.
And it can come about just very simply through rules of thumb, right? So it could be I always go right, I always go left. It's really difficult to work out how to rule out that it isn't rule of thumb unless you can speak to a lion and ask, are you doing this? It's difficult to work out.
I think one thing we were talking about with that was looking at whether the presence of the other lion changed their decision. So if this lion always goes right, then, we don't really know why it always goes right. But if it only goes right when it's with that partner, and it only goes left when it's with another partner, that's when we might be able to tease out that there is some
type of decision making beyond I just always go right.
I guess you can really manipulate right.
No, but with enough we're hoping that we will have enough hunts with this that we will be able to see, does that even happen? Do they ever shift their behavior? And if they do, does this indicate that they are making decisions?
Maybe one day Ian will build us a virtual machine for lions.
Yes, we'd love to get a lion in an imaging hangar.
You were talking to this guy who just disappeared earlier about looking at be a way to look at like a risk?
In terms of risk from other lions, risk on the landscape.
I don't know, risk from lions taking on a particular strategy.
Yeah. I mean, so death, so there is some risk to some large prey. So for example, I have seen male lions that have died because of a gemsbok, which has really big horns, has spiked it. But it does happen quite rarely, actual death, and lions are remarkably resilient to injury. So I think this is where long-term studies could come in. You could look at something, I think you would need a good 20 years of data to look at what the risks were, because you'd have to have observed the hunt happening in the first place, or at least the density of prey in the area, then observe the injury and see that. That would be really cool, because I think there is some risk, but I think the bigger risks to lions on the landscape are humans and other animals, and I think this is the risk that they've been shown to be really sensitive to, and this is the one I think we'd be quite interested in mapping, because this is a shared landscape in Namibia, so it's humans and animals very much integrated together, and that is where you do have some issues sometimes.
Are there any other foraging strategies by the lions that might fall into a similar task division? For example, I don't know, stealing a carcass or something from other animals, or stealing prey from other animals?
They do scavenge.
They do, and they will steal carcasses. I would think where you would see it would be territory defense. So some of the experiments that were done, we talked a bit about leadered laggard, but the big experiment that was done was with territorial incursions, actually. So lions they did a playback experiment where they would play the roars of unfamiliar individuals, and they'd either play one roar or two roars or three roars, and they would play it to one lion or a pair of lions. And what they found is you'd consistently get, let me think if I'm getting this right. If I get this wrong, it's because I haven't read the paper in a while. One would lead and the other would lag to approach the speaker. These studies also found that lions can count. So if there was a higher number, if they were outnumbered, they wouldn't approach. So there are different, territory defense is another place that we've talked about looking at these kinds of questions. And we've toyed with the idea of doing some playback experiments with these lions, because it's a really good way to get at these questions of how are they making decisions and how are they working together and what risks are they taking or not taking.
I think for stealing carcasses, I mean, it's difficult because we don't really have spotted hyenas in our areas, very much the ones we work in, and that's kind of the only thing that's big enough and enough of them to really be a challenge for a lion, because the lion is not going to have a problem with a leopard, and it's not going to have a problem with a brown hyena in itself. So if they want the carcass, they'll take it. So they don't necessarily need another one. Yeah. But in other systems, I could imagine that would also be something that they would have to consider. Mm-hmm.
I was curious how you think the landscape would influence this hunting, because you're working in like a very mountainous area. The photos you showed kind of were lions approaching a large group of wildebeest by watering hole, and like
Yes.
the strategies. But if you're on like a slope, there's not really the same opportunities. Or are they predominantly likely catching prey by watering holes?
Well, if they are catching on the slope. So in the Karoo, I was talking to a lion biologist there. Oh, sorry, in South Africa. But it's a mountainous landscape in South Africa, similar mountain elevation. And the lions there apparently are taking prey down on the slopes. I'd imagine if you're looking for role specialization in that, you might expect one to chase the prey species down to one that's laying in ambush. So there are possibilities for it to occur on the mountain. We don't know if that's where they're hunting. They could be hunting. When we were there, they killed, what did they kill?
They killed a giraffe, and then they killed goats.
Open. Yeah.
Lots of goats.
Lots of goats.
Which is not ideal. But it is something we're hoping to help. I mean, so our collars are feeding into the early warning systems. I mean, it's something we don't talk about here, but in all of the systems we work in, we have a lot of involvement with local NGOs and with conservation efforts and with capacity building. It's a really large part of what we do and why we collaborate together, because we hold the same values on that. So yeah, I don't know. Goats are a shame.
Goats are a problem. But there are opportunities for it to have different.
Yeah.
You could imagine different roles just in a different context. So it might not be right wing, left wing. It might be I'm the chaser and I'm the ambusher.
Yeah, I mean, the whole having one individual go wait for something to come is a very fascinating idea, or like concept, and how they coordinate that.
Yeah.
And like, what's the time lag between detecting the prey and setting up all these things is super interesting.
It's something they've described in this actually with these, not these lions, but with the pride that they came from. They had a lot of, the rangers qualitatively reconstructed kill sites based on their interpretation of it. And that's something whenever they were hunting giraffe that they described in this landscape, was they would chase them down. You get these like gullies, and that they would have one of the males there and they would chase them down into it. So, you know, that's, you know, anecdotal, but, you know, over time we might be able to pick that up, which would be really cool. There we go.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much for coming.